Subscribe to The Honest Critique for current affairs, movie, book, and product reviews. Also, make sure you press the bell icon to get notified whenever we upload a new video. The views, information, or opinions expressed during the video series are solely those of the individuals and do not necessarily represent those of The Honest Critique and its employees. The following video contains strong language which may be offensive to some viewers. Viewer discretion advised.
Hello and welcome to a very special episode we are recording for The Honest Critique. Today we are joined by Dr. Guy Burton, an accomplished scholar and adjunct professor at Brussels School of Governance, whose expertise spans in the field of political science, international relations, and intricate politics of rising powers. With extensive research in topics ranging from BRICS to politics of Latin America and Middle East, Dr. Burton's insights have provided invaluable perspectives on the multifaceted intersection between these regions and global power shifts. In this enlightening interview, we'll delve into his latest book, China and Middle East Conflicts, to explore the complex interaction between China's growing influence and the intricate web of conflicts in the Middle East. So thank you so much for taking your time and speaking to us.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you.
Sir, you mentioned China's historical presence in the Middle East dating back to the mid-20th century. How can China's role evolve over time, and how have its interactions with conflicts changed in response to global dynamics, such as the end of Cold War and the rise of China as a global power?
So my work, the book that you referenced, I think what the value I think it offers is that it provides us a broad historical context, because I think a lot of the people who are interested in China and the Middle East tends to look at it very much as what's happening now, what's going on now, and don't really put it into a wider perspective. So a lot of the effort of that book was to put the Chinese current events into a more historical narrative. And so if you look at that over the decades, China's relationship towards the region has shifted. Obviously, the People's Republic, when it was established in 1949, it was very much focused on dealing with things at home, consolidating the regime. So it really doesn't start to have much of a foreign policy, and more specifically a policy related to the Middle East, until around the mid-1950s. And that is a time when you're in the middle of the Cold War. So, of course, you've got the Americans and the Soviets at loggerheads globally. And also the Soviets have really snapped up, as it were, the more revolutionary regimes. So the Arab nationalists, like the Egyptian Gamal Nasser in Egypt and the Ba'athist regimes in Iraq. So that really very much only leaves the national liberation groups, the non-state actors like Palestinians themselves, but more specifically the Algerian nationalists, the National Liberation Front there. So really, China's relations is with these armed groups, these nationalist groups, and it identifies with them. And in some ways, actually, it supports their liberation struggles, sometimes not only diplomatically, but with small arms. So in that sense, it's not really a peacemaker or mediator. It's more of it's playing a role in the exacerbation of conflict. From the 1970s, however, you start to see the Chinese state shift. It starts to build more diplomatic relations with regimes in the region. Perhaps there's a realization as well that these armed groups are destabilizing, so it makes sense to work with other governments as partners. And you see a diminution of ideology. And that really continues. It particularly gains significance from the late 70s, early 1980s, when in the wake of the Deng Xiaoping government, the Chinese prioritized development and economic development, particularly at home. And so the Middle East becomes less important politically, but over time becomes more important economically, particularly in relation to energy resources. From 1993, China becomes a net importer of hydrocarbons. And so the Middle East, as a major source of oil and gas, that goes up in Chinese estimations. It also means that China's more concerned about stability in the region, because, of course, if there is instability, that is potential threat to the supply of hydrocarbons. So you see the Chinese very much sort of geared towards economic factors. That continues. That's really kind of been the emphasis as well. Even if you come to more recently with the Belt and Road Initiative, this has very much been a debate and a discussion about economic development. In terms of China's approach towards conflict, whereas in the early part, so the mid part of the last century, it was supporting these nationalist groups, as I mentioned. By the end of the century and into the last couple of decades, it's very much wanting to see conflict diminished because it's a problem for economic exchange. So as a result, you would see in the region, particularly after 2011 with the Arab uprisings, that was a long period of convulsion within the region. And obviously of concern to the Chinese. They did not want to see the region as volatile as it was.
Yes, sir. And that's actually what I wanted to ask you next, that how does China's Middle East policy demonstrate a multi-dimensional approach, and what are the key facets of this approach? You have mentioned in the book that China's foreign policy has shifted from being a standoffish to a more assertive, especially since Xi Jinping's presidency. So could you elaborate on this assertiveness has manifested in China's interaction with the Middle East, particularly in the context of conflicts?
Yes. So, I mean, I wouldn't say that the Chinese have become particularly active in terms of being sort of a political actor. Certainly, I mean, they are more present, and there are a number of developments that have led to this, I think. For one, you've alluded to Xi Jinping, and certainly his approach has been more assertive on the global stage. There is a sense that compared to the Deng Xiaoping and the presidents that succeeded him, who took the position that the Chinese should not become too visible or not create too much of a furore, Xi seems to be prepared for the Chinese to play a greater role. That also coincides with China becoming a more established player on the world stage, right? So what we've seen after 2000 is China becoming shifting from being a rising power to now being sort of the number two economy in the world. It's certainly it is not a peer to the United States. In that sense, it's not equal, but it is far ahead of many other large economies, even if it is still behind the United States. And of course, what you now have at the global level is this debate, this development happening where the Americans and the Chinese are starting to face off. We're in a discussion as to whether there's an emerging new Cold War, this time between the US and China. And so in that context, it would seem that whatever China does in the Middle East is going to generate interest and attention. In terms of, you talk about it being multidimensional, multifaceted. I mean, I still think it's driven by economic concerns, economic exchange, but the nature of that economic exchange has shifted. So if you went back a couple of decades to the 1990s, when China was becoming a net energy importer, that was the principal form of exchange. But what we've seen since 2000, and particularly after 2010, is Chinese exchange with certain economies in the region, not all of them, but certain economies in the region becoming both broader and deeper. And I think this is most pertinent when you come to places like Gulf economies like the Saudi Arabia and the UAE, as well as with Israel. So you start to see the Chinese and those Middle Eastern regional partners, the economic exchange is diversifying. It's more products. It's also going beyond sort of manufacturing and sort of, tangible goods into services. And it's also two-way. So what you're now starting to see is, so for example, the sovereign wealth funds from Saudi Arabia and the UAE and Qatar and others investing in China. And it's in things like, high tech, it's in real estate, it's in healthcare. So there is a deepening economic exchange that is going on there. And so then it kind of makes sense that you would imagine China's interest in the region grows, as well as regional interest in China.
So what ways do you think that China has been enhancing its soft power in the Middle East, and how has it contributed to its growing influence in this region?
So I think one of the things that's interesting about China, I mean, as I've pointed out to you, the first question, my work was very much providing a historical context and historical narrative. But I think memories are pretty short in many parts of the world, and including the Middle East. When I first started looking at China in the region, and this was with particular reference to Palestine, and that is actually where historically there's been quite a close relationship and support for some of the armed groups in the past, diplomatic support for Palestinian self-determination. But what was interesting is when I first started doing this work and reaching out to potential informants, interviewees, not many people were aware of the previous history between China and the Palestinians. And I think this is also echoed more broadly across the region, partly because China is a faraway country. It doesn't seem to have had much of a presence for many people, and it's not up close and personal like the United States is, or more, I guess, into if you're thinking about in the Gulf, the British, who only left the region in the early 1970s. So China is more of an unknown quantity, and with that comes some advantages. Not many people are familiar with what China is and what it's about. And so that gives them a certain latitude, a certain flexibility to play with, which, say, for example, the Americans can't. You've also had in the last few years, I think, as well. Well, I also should say that the emphasis on the economic development has meant that the Chinese don't really get involved in the politics of the region, which is something that creates a problem for Western countries, because the West, at least rhetorically, its foreign policy is given over to liberalism, human rights, and so that creates problems every time they have conversations with these regional elites. The Chinese don't care about that, so that makes it a little bit more flexible, at least from the elite level. But I also think that if you think in the last few years as well, since the pandemic, the Chinese made great play in with its COVID diplomacy. So when the world was starting to shut down, it was the Chinese who were actually out of the blocks faster than the Americans and the West and the others in providing guidance, in providing resources, materials, masks, and then when the vaccines became available, providing vaccines within the region. So the Chinese managed to build a lot of goodwill that way, even though despite the source of COVID coming from China. So there's a number of different ways that soft power can play out. I think it helps that there was a lack of sufficient knowledge or understanding of China, but also proactive efforts by the Chinese in the last few years.
That is what I wanted to ask you in the next question, because you mentioned how China has we have a snail's memory when we come to talk about Chinese influence in the Middle East. But I want to actually ask you, since you mentioned about the Palestinian context, could you elaborate China's role as a peacemaker in the Middle East and provide example of specific instances where it has mediated conflicts or promote a certain sort of stability?
Yeah, are you talking about with regard to the Palestinians or more generally?
A more general sense. Since you mentioned Palestine, I just brought to the Palestinian topic, but in more general sense.
Sure. So, well, I mean, in terms of China's contribution to peacemaking, I mean, there's been a lot of interest in this since the start of the year, partly because the Chinese hosted the talks between the Saudis and the Iranians, which led to an agreement to reestablish diplomatic relations. So after that happened, there was quite a bit of interest into this and whether the Chinese were going to become more active. I'm sure we might come to that. But prior to this, I wouldn't say that the Chinese have been particularly active in trying to mediate conflict. They have become involved, but only when it's in their interests or they have a particular concern. If you go back, so really, in my book, I say that perhaps the first moment you have of the Chinese making an effort at mediating conflict after 2000 is in Darfur. And there's a reason for that. In the late 1990s, when the country, or at least its leader, was under sanctions, international Western sanctions, no one was prepared to invest in the country and help develop its oil industry. The Chinese were. So the Chinese had a presence in Sudan from the late 1990s and into the early 2000s. So when the Darfur crisis erupted, and there are a number of the oil fields in that area, but also in the south of the country, in a way, the Chinese were kind of dragged into this, which is also one of the points that I make more broadly, that whereas many of the people who are interested in China and the Middle East, at least when I started working on this about a decade ago, were interested in the economy and interested in the Belt and Road. And my interest was in, what does this all mean for conflict? Partly because, yes, the Chinese don't want to get involved in politics. They don't want to get involved in conflict, but they're not going to be able to avoid that. The more economic investment and development you do in the region, the more you're going to get drawn into differences and spats by others. So this is, I think, what happened in the case of Darfur. You had the Chinese becoming a player, and for other reasons as well. The issue went before the United Nations Security Council, of which China is obviously a permanent member. But also, the Chinese had a presence in Darfur, and they were not seen as antagonistic by the then Bashar regime. So the Chinese presented themselves as a middleman. They were saying, you've got the West on the one side, who are very critical of Bashar and what he's doing in Darfur, and on the other side, we can talk to Bashar in a way that the West can't. So over the course of about a year and a half, 2 years, you see the Chinese talking back and forth between the West and subsequently between the African Union and the regime. And eventually the Chinese are able to get an agreement. They do have to put up some troops in the region as well. But really, the sort of Chinese presence in Sudan and in its conflicts disappears really after independence of South Sudan. Partly because much of the oil industry is in South Sudan, so Sudan is no longer an issue. Around the same time, the late 2000s, you also have the Chinese getting involved in the anti-piracy operations off the Horn of Africa. You have significant a problem with piracy there. But just as the West does a coordinated program of naval action, the Chinese don't join that, but they do it independently. So the Chinese are present in that respect. And then I guess you've also got in 2013 to 15 when the nuclear agreement with Iran is resolved, the joint comprehensive plan of action. The Chinese again play the middleman between the West, and particularly the United States on one hand, and Iran on the other. And in a way, the Chinese can do that because, number one, they have a partnership or relationship with the Iranians that many of these Western countries don't, and number two, they're trusted more by the Iranians. But what's important to note in all of this is that it's not the Chinese who are taking the lead in any of this. It happens to be others who have said this is an issue that needs to be addressed, and the Chinese get involved if they think it's in their interest to do so, and if they have a presence. So it's somewhat limited. If you go to other disputes and spats, if we think about more recently, say for example the intra-Gulf crisis between Saudi Arabia and the UAE on one side and Qatar on the other, which lasted between 2017 and 21, the Chinese didn't get involved. Well, they did say at the very start, we're willing to act as a mediator, but none of them took them up seriously on that, and the Chinese never pushed.
Right, sir. So how do you think that China's Belt and Road Initiative play a role in its policy towards the Middle East? And what are some of the key infrastructure projects China has been involved in this region?
Yes, so the Belt and Road is really sort of captured the imagination over the last decade. I think it's worth noting as well, though, that the Belt and Road itself is not necessarily a Middle East only project. It had its origins in the immediate neighborhoods, so Central Asia and China's involvement with its partners there. And there is, of course, a bit of a discussion and a debate as to what was the purpose of the Belt and Road. Was it really to develop these or build infrastructure projects in the region as part of developing those economies for further Chinese investment and activity, or as sort of a extension towards more developed economies in the West. I mean, that's probably another debate to be had, but certainly it's the case in with the Belt and Road that it did capture the imagination of many in the Middle East. There have been a number of projects, although they tend to be concentrated. China's approach to the Middle East is not a uniform one, and if you think about the last decade, where we've had the uprisings and the violence that has sort of come out, most notably in Syria, that has meant that certain places have not been able to access Chinese resources and funding. Which is notable, actually, to sort of see places like Iran, which have been under sanctions, Syria, which is coming out of a war, really wanting the Chinese to be, come in and help develop their projects or develop their infrastructure. But it's very hard for the Chinese to do that because, of course, it's still considered to be a risky venture. So what you really see is Chinese investment in the Gulf, which is a much more stable region, as well as investment in Egypt and Algeria. And Egypt's obviously currently undergoing the construction of a new capital. There's been a number of Chinese construction firms have won the contracts for that. But what you also can tell is, if you want to know where the Chinese are influential and where they're doing where they're more active, is to look at the nature of their diplomatic relationships. So they have what they call strategic partnerships and comprehensive strategic partnerships. And the comprehensive strategic partnerships tend to be those where they have the strongest or the strongest political relationship or the strongest economic relationships. And in the Middle East, that's basically Algeria, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Iran. And then what you have with Israel is what they call an innovation partnership, which is based primarily on technology rather than what Belt and Road is, which is roads, ports, highways.
Yes, and moving on from that, what are the economic and diplomatic factors that have contributed to China's increasing engagement with Middle Eastern countries? And how has China's approach been when we compare that to the United States? Of course, we can say that China is a growing power. I mean, it's the second largest economic power right now, and it's growing militarily. But is there something different that has happened in the last few years that has increased its engagement with the Middle Eastern countries?
Well, I think it refers back to an earlier point that I made, which is that, because you asked about, so how does it compare with the United States? I think one of the difficulties that the US and other Western countries face when they're engaging these countries, and by the way, I'm talking primarily with these governments, is that they have ideological baggage, or in the form of liberal sort of commitments to liberal values and human rights, which is not something that the Chinese have. So the Chinese basically go into the region, establish these partnerships with these, let's be honest, authoritarian, autocratic regimes, in which they just focus on what's good for you, what's good for me, economic projects that are primarily about development, that don't present awkward questions. Also, I think maybe the Chinese have been a little bit, they've kind of been the first mover in all of this. So if you think back to, obviously there's been the pandemic, but before the pandemic, we had the global financial crisis in around 2008-9. And one of the consequences of that was that many of these Western countries, which would have either done sort of development aid or had, the big, large businesses, they pulled back and pulled out of the developing world. That kind of left space for the Chinese to move in. So I think it's a combination of a number of different things, separation of politics and economics, sort of in a way, a kind of a Western retreat from the region, a lack of familiarity with the Chinese, what they're really about, China's focus on economic issues, or at least narrowing it down to that. And I think finally as well, I think there's also an emerging transactionalism in diplomacy more generally, and we're seeing this. We know that we're in a situation where the nature of the global order is changing, and what that has meant is, as we move from a previously American-led unipolar world in which you as as a government leader, your decision is whether or not how far you go with the Americans. Do you support them, or do you risk generating their ire by opposing them? What we're now seeing is a much more multipolar world, in which it doesn't necessarily mean that you don't have to go along with the Americans. There are alternative partners you can work with, like China, like India, like Russia. But what's interesting is it doesn't mean that you reject the Americans. But what I think is also happening is this much more transactional approach, which is to say, many of these global South countries, these developing countries in the Middle East, are saying, why do I need to go just to the Americans for this? I can get resources, I can get diplomatic support or whatever from others as well. Doesn't close the door to the Americans. What it is basically diplomacy based on self-interest. It's very transactional. It's not based on values. It's just based on, what can I get for me? What's important right now? And also, and this transactionalism is also very limited in the sense that you as a government might have differences with another government, but you can file away your differences and focus on what you can agree on. And I think we see this, for example, say with the Russians and Turkey, right, during the current war in Ukraine. This has put Turkey as a NATO member on the opposite side from Russia, but despite them having their differences, they're still able to find a way to work on things like, although it did break down, at least they were able to find a resolution to the export of grain from Ukrainian and Russian ports through the Bosphorus. So what you see is these countries saying, look, we may not agree with you on this particular topic, but that shouldn't mean that we can't work with you on another topic.
And that actually brings me to my next question about the implications of this Chinese growing presence in the Middle East for other global powers like Russia or the United States. How might China's engagement affect this regional dynamics and security? Because China has been drawn into conflicts such as the Sudan and the Iran conflict. And could you delve into these cases and explain the factors that led to China being more actively engaged as a mediator?
Yes, well, I think I mentioned, how they the broad reasons for how they got involved in Sudan and Iran, because they already had a presence in those countries. They were and they were also a little bit more trusted by those countries, particularly when those governments looked at who was opposing them, right? So the Chinese approach is really to play the middleman. It's not to take a lead in things and say, this is what's on the table and you're going to take it, but more to say, look, maybe you can find a way of bringing the two sides together. There's actually been some interesting scholarly work that looks at this. A couple of academics a few years back, Sundergang and I've forgotten his name now, but they wrote about what they called quasi mediation diplomacy, in which this approach that the Chinese take is less about setting an agenda and then bringing people to the table, or more about letting antagonists try and will find a way forward. And if they then want someone like the Chinese to become involved, then they go to the Chinese. China doesn't set the agenda; it kind of follows them. So it's kind of like leading from behind, if you will. So that's one approach that's sort of possibly on the table. I still think there's questions as to whether that, you can really make a claim that this is the model based on only a few cases out there. But if you look at other areas, I mean, it's very noticeable that, for example, in the current, after the then Trump administration, withdrew the Americans from the nuclear agreement with Iran, and the Biden administration came in and said, we're going to put that back in place. It's now been 2.5 years? And it still hasn't been resolved. And what's interesting is that China is a participant to those talks, but it's not been playing a very active role, or at least so far as we can tell, they've not been actively trying to bring the Americans and the Iranians together on this. Certainly, they talk to each side, but they haven't been taking a lead. So I think it's important to not overdo the Chinese approach to peace mediation in the region. You also mentioned, I think, the Russians as well. I think what's also notable about Russia is that, yes, Russia had over the last decade and a bit been building its presence in the region. It'd been exploring. So its level of economic exchange is a bit more limited, a little bit more narrow than that of the Chinese. Certainly, weapons sales played an important role in Russia's relations with many of the countries in the region. If you look at Syria, for example, the sending of mercenaries like those from the Wagner Group, they were important. But the problem is, of course, the Russians are a diminishing power, and this was happening even before the Ukraine war. Whereas China's sort of, I think most people would say that China has graduated from being a rising power to being the established number 2 power in the world. So, and the next question is how, at some point, it presumably will challenge the United States. The Russians have been fighting a rearguard action because basically since, there's, I suppose, some recovery after the years at the end of the Cold War. They've become a member of the BRICS. But when you look at the BRICS, for example, it's really, a bunch of rising powers: China, India, Brazil, South Africa, but Russia is kind of the declining one. And I think Ukraine war has probably exacerbated that as well. So I don't necessarily see the Russians as playing a significant long-term role in the region, and certainly not as a peace mediator.
Right. So China brokered the agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran to restore diplomatic relations and reduce tensions. How do you see China's role in facilitating such agreements evolving the Middle East?
I mean, I'd raise a point of caution about this, because as I just said, I don't think that you should overdo Chinese mediation here. This was actually a process in which other actors had been more prominent and more active. The Chinese basically came in at the end. So what you had was, certainly it's true that about 2 and a bit years ago, the Chinese did say it would be good. I mean, it would make sense at a regional level for those antagonists to come together to resolve their differences. But they didn't actively try to bring the Saudis and the Iranians together. Instead, what happened was Iraq began that. It provided a channel. Also, maybe was it Iraq or maybe it was Oman? I forget which, but I think those 2 countries basically provided the space for Saudis and Iranian officials to talk to each other over the course of the 2 years. And so this China-hosted meeting was really at the very end of this. In a way, the agreement was going to be signed whether or not the Chinese were involved. So I think it's a little, whether that is a model for how the Chinese do things. I can certainly see how it would be attractive to them, because it generated a lot of media interest. And I know that from talking to colleagues who work on China in the Middle East, we did point out to journalists that you need to be looking at what was happening beforehand. This was only the end product. And certainly we're not seeing this happening anywhere else at the moment. Certainly, for example, I think also, but there is, what's interesting is that the Chinese have been putting out a whole bunch of different initiatives over the last few years. So last year you had them talking about a global security initiative, which, when it came to the context of the Middle East, they said there needs to be some kind of regional order, regional establishment of stability there, and made reference to the Palestine question as well. But again, one of the issues about all of these statements is that and declarations, that they tend to be sort of strong on the rhetoric. The question then becomes, what's actually happening? And as I said in the previous question, answer to the previous question, the Chinese don't tend to take the lead. They do put out statements and say it would be great for you to try and find some solution to this, but they don't necessarily then take the lead in trying to bring those antagonists together.
So as China deepens its engagement with the Middle East, what strategies is it employing to build trust and strength partnerships, and how does it compare to the United States approach in this region? What strategies might the US employ to maintain its influence and partnership in this region? What do you think? about this?
Yeah, so you've got the Belt and Road, I think, still remains important, and it's just celebrating its 10th anniversary this month as well. And I've alluded to one initiative already, the Global Security Initiative, but you've also had a few months before that the Global Development Initiative, which Xi Jinping announced at the UN General Assembly. These are, in many ways, they're not. The question is, are they really initiatives, or are they just confirmation of activities that the Chinese are already involved in? They don't state. What's notable about them is that they take a very sort of state-oriented approach to development and security. It's, in fact, in many ways, there's some of the stuff that they've come out with in recent years, talking about development, talking about security. They do see the two as somewhat linked, but they don't necessarily see it as something that needs to be resolved at grassroots or community level. So they do have, because their partners are primarily governments, other governments, and they do seem to have this sort of floating boat mentality to their declarations, which is, if we can put money in, if we can build economies, we build markets, build development in these countries, what that's going to mean is that prosperity is going to rise, not just nationally, but also individually. And then as prosperity increases, so should all these grievances, which give rise to religious different, conflicts, nationalist conflicts, sectarianism, or whatever, they will disappear. This seems to be the thinking that is going on in Beijing. I may be wrong, but that seems to be the impression. So all of these different initiatives, broadly, they have a multitude of them, but I think they're broadly all in line with each other. They all sort of speak to each other. They all say, let's work with other partner governments. Let's focus on development. Developing the economy will boost individual prosperity. It will reduce unhappiness. It will reduce security risks. So there is that. Now, how have the West responded to this? Well, I think one way that they've done this is the G7 about last year came out with what they call the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, which was agreed at the G7 summit in 2022, and then the Americans who took the lead in this were saying what we want to try and do is mobilize about $600 billion in both public and private funding by 2027. This is a global initiative, of course. Keep in mind, it's not just for the Middle East; it's for it's for the world, the developing countries. How does that compares to, if you go back, I say back around sort of talking about Belt and Road back in around 2014, 15, 16. They've talked about the Belt and Road being aiming for around 900 billion. So you can see that the G7 initiative is already a little bit less than what Belt and Road was set out to be. But then also, I think it's also worth keeping in mind how much of that Belt and Road has actually been spent. And some of the figures out there, I looked for you. So the China Global Tracker, which is an initiative by the American Enterprise Institute, they suggest that in the 10 years between 2014 and 2023, that it's been that you've had about $392 billion spent. So that's less than half the ambition for Belt and Road. And then if you go and look in the region itself, into the Middle East, which is what we're interested in, over that period, we're looking at those countries, the ones that China has most involvement with. So Iraq, Iran, Saudi, the UAE, Egypt, Algeria, Israel. You're looking at 18 billion. So the Middle East constitutes quite a small part of Belt and Road.
Right, so considering China's pragmatic approach to the region, how do you foresee its role evolving in the Middle East conflicts and geopolitics over the next few years?
Well, I think you've kind of answered it there. So it's going to be pragmatic. I don't see it shifting in any great way. I think it's going to continue to be. I mean, unless something significant happens, I can't see it being any difference to what it is now, which is for the Chinese to only really become involved when they see it as either in their interests or absolutely necessary that they get involved. of course, they're going to be looking for eye-catching moments. So if you recall, about 2 years ago, I think it was, when we were having intercommunal violence in Israel, and there was rising violence between Israel and Palestinians, Hamas in Gaza, but then there were also violence in some of the mixed cities of Israel, right, between Arab Israelis and Arab Palestinians and Israelis. What was interesting at the time was that the Chinese came out and made a number of statements, and people thought, "Oh, is this a change is this a qualitative change in the way that China's approaching the Israel-Palestine question?" And my argument at the time was that no, because the reason why China was getting such exposure was because it happens to be president of the UN Security Council at that particular time, and of course, the UN Security Council was discussing the subject. So I think what you'll probably see is, certainly the Chinese making sure that they're present or having something to say whenever there's a conflict or potential peace agreement, as we saw between the Iranians and the Saudis. But I don't see them going all out to try and resolve every conflict out there, or to insert themselves where there is no benefit, so no tangible benefit to them doing so. One thing you've also got to keep in mind as well, there is a cost, right, to mediation. Certainly we sort of see it. It's, on the one hand, being a mediator has been great in raising your profile, and we've seen this with various actors like Norway and the Oslo Accords, or Qatar, and the Taliban in Afghanistan. But you've also got to think about what happens if you're not successful. What happens if you broker an agreement and the agreement breaks down? What does that, are you committed to getting them back to the table again? Does that not damage your credibility as a mediator? So there are, it's all very well to talk about, inserting yourself and becoming more active and becoming a peacemaker, but there are costs to it as well.
That actually brings me, since you mentioned about Israel, I wanted to ask you that your book also highlights China's growing ties with Israel, including infrastructure investment and technology collaborations, as you mentioned in one of the answers before. Now, turning to the issue of Israel and Palestine, you note that China's position has evolved from being supportive of Palestinians to establishing diplomatic relations with both Israel and Palestine. How has China navigated this delicate balance, and what implication does it have for its potential role in the Israel-Palestine conflict? How does this economic partnership impact China's political and strategic position in the region?
Yes, and so I mean, the relationship between China and the Israelis and Palestinians is a really interesting one. I mean, I mentioned that at the outset, that back in the 1950s, 1960s, the Chinese, particularly in their more revolutionary, radical period, were very, very supportive of the Palestinian nationalist movement, and even provide them with, some small arms and some financial assistance, not a lot, but a bit. At the same time, they were very, very critical of Israel, which they saw as an American lackey in the region. That changes. I mean, China and Israel established diplomatic relations in the early 1990s. By the way, that's a relationship that's interesting in its own right. It develops because during the 1980s, the Chinese needs to rebuild their military stocks, and some of those military stocks, tanks, weapons, etc., they would have been they got from the Soviets, but they're in a bad relationship with the Soviets. They're able to find another buyer, another seller, which is Israel, because they've captured all of this equipment on the Syria, from Syria and Egypt on the battlefield. So there is this clandestine arms trade that happens between Israel and China during the 1980s, which then is formalized in a diplomatic relationship, and then it can come out into the open. And so during the 1990s, especially after the Oslo Accords, where we had optimism that there was going to be peace between Israel and Palestine, the Chinese were not unique in this. All countries were starting to cultivate and build relations with both the Israelis and Palestinians, and the Chinese did the same as well. And of course, as Israel's economy develops, as it becomes more high tech, that is of interest to the Chinese. And some of the equipment that the Israelis were selling, technology that the Israelis were selling, was more high tech as well, I suppose. what is interesting, of course, is that all of this happened. If you've got to remember that Israel is the the principal American partner in the Middle East, right? So nothing that happens between Israel and China is happening without the Americans, at least tacitly accepting it. And so during the 1990s, you have Israel developing this relationship, sort of developing its economic activity in exchange with China. Well, then what you have in around 2000 is the Americans push back. They say, hang on a second, you're selling this Falcon, radar technology to the Chinese, which can be put into, their planes around Taiwan, which is another big American partner. Stop, you can't do it. And it's maybe it's a notable moment, because basically the Israelis suddenly have to face the fact that they've already taken, a down payment from the Chinese on this. But at the same time, the Americans are telling them you can't sell it. And so the Israelis basically don't sell the product. They give the money back to the Chinese. Of course, there's a little bit of diplomatic tension between the Chinese and the Israelis over this. But in the long run, the Chinese recognize that at the end of the day, Israel is an American ally. And this is why I think it's important, because after 2000, when the Chinese and the Israelis start to build, and particularly after 2010, when they start to, the economic relationship really starts to get going again, you start to see Americans starting to get worried from around 2016, 2017. They're concerned about Israel possibly contracting Huawei to provide, telecoms technology. They're worried about the Chinese redevelopment of Haifa port, because the American naval fleet is based there. So you start to see the Americans pressing on the Israelis and saying, you need to be careful about your relations with China here. And really, the Israelis take it on board. They know who is their primary partner, and of course, yes, it creates some difficulties with the Chinese, but the Chinese don't really push back because they know where things stand. And I think that is a relationship which both sides know that there is this third party, the Americans, who can limit it, and so the Chinese don't push it too much. It's not in their interest to do so. Sorry, you wanted to ask me something else about the peace process between Israel and Palestine, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
I asked you about, I guess, how has China navigated its delicate balance, and from being supportive of Palestinians to establishing diplomatic relations. Where do this will take forward China's role in this Palestinian conflict?
So we've talked a bit about the China-Israel relations, and I think so that provides some context to, well, the Israel-Palestine, I don't know what to call it, process, because there isn't one right now, right? Israelis and Palestinians do not talk to each other. It's been for the peace process, and I'm using quotation marks here, has been on hold for more than a decade, and it's frozen. So there is no peace process to talk about. And so I think what's interesting is that China's relations with Israel and the Palestinians continues independent of that process. I think in a way, there is also there is a challenge, because I think underlying this is obviously the economic relationship that China has with Israel is more important than its economic relationship with the Palestinians. Palestinians don't have much to offer the Chinese, frankly. And so what's happening is that in the absence of any peace process, all this is doing is just weighting China's relationship with Israel more than towards the Palestinians. So even if the Chinese and the Israelis and the Palestinians start talking together, it'd be very hard to see the Chinese as an honest broker in all of this, because in many ways their economic relationship outweighs that with the Palestinians.
And I wanted to ask you of how Abraham Accord in the region has played a role, and how does China look at this? Does China look at this that they don't have to toe the Palestinian lines to get the relationship with the Arab countries in order, and they can actually have an open trade with Israel and keep supporting Israel's missions without actually toeing the Palestinian lines? Does the Abraham Accord has defined that Israel-Palestinian relation for China?
So that's interesting, because I think when the Abraham Accords first came out, if you'd listened to some of the American commentators, they seemed very excited about the fact that that it wasn't its primary concern, but I think for some American policymakers there was a hope that by their partners like the UAE and Israel starting to talk to each other, not only would they counter the regional threat, Iran, but also it would squeeze out China. Why would if Israel and the UAE, who have complementary economies, can sort of talk to each other and develop their relationship with each other, then they don't need Chinese investment. They don't need Chinese resources. That was maybe some thinking that was going on in the Beltway, but in reality, I think the Chinese were quite happy with the Abraham Accords. It's as I've pointed out in the course of this discussion, one of the Chinese priorities for the region is stability and order, because more stability, more order ensures not a more security, more reliability when it comes to economic activity. Less stability, less order, that's a business risk. So from the Chinese perspective, the Abraham Accords could only be a good thing. And there is, well, I've not seen any work on this, and also it's pretty difficult to do, but there has been some conversations as to whether the Abraham Accords have also provided space for Chinese involvement in some aspects of technology transfer. So if you think about in the context of the UAE, right, it has a number of different sort of free zones, encourages it's sought to try and bring in financial services, media technologies. So it set up these free zones to do R&D and stuff. And for the Israelis, this is fantastic, because if you can set up an office there, you don't have the level of media and public scrutiny in the UAE that you would have at home. And that also is very attractive to the Chinese, because they want some of this technology, they want some of this equipment. What's been interesting is, I don't know if you're familiar with Jeff Halper, who's an Israeli, activist and writer, but he's written about the political economy of weapons development in Israel, and how not only is much of so there's a lot of the technology that's been developed in Israel has been developed either with a view to things like surveillance, which they've used the Palestinians as a laboratory for, or they've used or they've recruited personnel, because there's actually there's a high tech sector within the army that's sort of provided space for people to train and learn, and they've gone off and set up these sort of tech ventures afterwards. So what's really interesting is that when we talk about we don't really talk enough about it, but when China is showing interest in Israeli technology, you have to say, to what extent are they also sort of buying into the Israeli mistreatment of the Palestinians, because some of that technological development has come at the cost of the Palestinians.
Right, so this is my last question. The use of local currency in trading has been in recent discussions, such as Saudi Arabia and Iran using RMB instead of the US dollar. What potential consequences do you see for US influence and global monetary system if more countries in the Middle East will shift away from using the US dollar for trade?
Yeah, so that's been in the news quite recently, and of course, with the recent BRICS summit, that was perhaps top of the agenda. I don't see it. It makes sense. I can understand why countries would like to, trade in their own currencies as well. Of course, if you are trading in dollars, you're sort of kind of at risk of American, fiscal policy. You see that with those countries that have dollarized. So there have been cases where I think it's Ecuador and others, have had to bring in the dollar instead of their own currency, and then of course they're tied to whatever the Federal Reserve does on interest rates. They lose their own individual independent decision making on that. So I kind of understand where they're coming from. But at the same time, I think it's important to not overstate this. This right now it's more of an aspiration than an actuality. If you actually look at global payments, about 43% of global payments in the world are currently done in dollars, and 32% in euros. and yuan, so renminbi, only makes up 2%. So you've got a long way to go before Chinese currency is going to challenge or threaten the sort of the primacy of the dollar. So I mean, I can see where I saw some commentators getting quite sort of agitated about this, but I think this is quite a way away. And I think also you've also got to overcome the the confidence issues as well, that people still put trust in the dollar more than the renminbi at the moment.
Well, that actually is a great note to end the conversation. And I guess in a world where geopolitical dynamics are in constant flux and rising powers like China increasingly play an influential role, it is essential for us to have experts like you who can unravel these complexities of these relationships. And I guess that was our humble attempt at this podcast. So thank you so much, sir, for taking your time and speaking to us. It was an honor hosting you for the interview.
Oh, thank you for having me. I hope it was of use.
No, thank you so much, sir, for taking out your time. Thank you.